Welcome everyone to another RS Insights. I'm joined today by Simon, who is our Chief Engine Builder and 4Cam expert, as today we're going to talk everything Carrera. A word synonymous with Porsche at this point, after 70 plus years of production, and a word Spanish in origin, meaning to race. Right. So I think of all the Carreras, even the current cars they're producing today, through the decades, Carrera GTs from 0405, all the different Carrera RS variants, Carrera Club Sports, we really have to start at the origin in the 50s of when Porsche first used Carrera as a moniker, as a model, really to commemorate success they had at the Carrera Panamericana, that awesome, dangerous race up and down the Pan American Highway. So thinking about that, Simon, in the Carreras, we have a nice 3 historically significant cars parked here amongst us. We have a 1957 Carrera GT Coupe, which was actually the first GT Coupe imported into the United States via, of course, Max Hoffman, right? The 58 Speedster, GS Speedster behind us, is the last GS Speedster ever built. And we have a 1962 Carrera 2, which is the last iteration of the 4Cam engine. So kind of a nice sampling of historical cars here amongst us. And when people think Carrera, they automatically go to 4Cam engines, right?
Absolutely.
And that's one of the biggest things that sets them apart from a normal Speedster, right? As it doesn't have a pushrod engine.
Correct.
So tell us a little bit about the history, the beginning of Ferdinand and Ferry relying on industry-leading engineers such as Ernst Fuhrmann, and how the 4Cam engine really came to be.
Right, and Porsche's strong point, of course, was the fact that they were racing 356s and doing very well with them, which made them very popular, and they realized early on that this was a valuable tool. Motorsports sold cars. This was back in the 50s. And they also, doing that development, realized that there was only so far they were going to make it with the pushrod engine, and that they were reaching the limits of its capabilities. And in fact, back in 1952, Ernst Fuhrmann was working in the engineering department. He'd worked on several projects previously to do with race cars and race engines. He'd done his thesis in college, University of Vienna, on valve train designs for internal combustion engines. So he was well versed, and I think he had some ideas about how to proceed when he was asked to devise an engine that would take the company forwards, specifically in motorsports.
Yeah, that's a great point, Simon. Kind of the history that we don't always get, right, when we think of Fuhrmann. 1952, how does, at the time, post-war Ferry and Fuhrmann come together when they decide to develop the first 547 engine?
Right, well, I don't know exactly how they got together, but they met, of course, working for the senior Porsche's design business, doing design work for other manufacturers, and Fuhrmann actually worked on a Cisitalia race car project, and became known to Ferry through that, and ultimately ended up working in Gmünd when they first started the Porsche production, and the car came to be.
Right, so that's 1952 into 53. They plop in this great 4Cam engine into a 550, and where do they debut the car?
Well, actually, the first 550s didn't have 4Cam engines. Early on, they had a very harsh timeline to get the engine built, which is why I think Ernst Fuhrmann had some secrets in his back pocket. I think he'd been working on this project since he was in university. And I think it just gave him an opportunity, a playground where he could start investigating some of the options and doing sort of experimental work. I think he knew what was and what wasn't going to work before he committed to Ferry's request to build this engine for the 53 season because it only left him about 6 to 8 months, which is astonishing even now. It must have been a crazy timeline back then. But even though they got it done, the first 550s were ready before the engine. So they actually raced the 550. The first 2 prototypes ran with pushrod engines. And at their first outing, they were very successful. They won.
Right.
They went to the Nürburgring. They did the Tour de France race, I believe,
yeah.
and went to Le Mans. They were very successful out of the box, even though essentially they were, fighting with one arm tied behind their back. The 4-cam wasn't available yet, but it was a good indication of what was to come for the company. In fact, they were so confident they shipped the cars off to South America and started making history there too. So
that's fantastic. All great stuff. And although we are amongst, great historic cars out here outside, to help us delve into a little bit more of the intricacies of these 4-cams, I hear you have some pretty cool stuff in your shop that requires a pass. Can we go into your secret laboratory?
We can do a little show and tell,
yeah?
I'm sure. Yes.
Great.
Absolutely. Come on in, Tim.
Wow, this is what an engine room should look like. Nice and clean, amazing.
Some of the time.
Well,
some of the time.
Well, that's good. So great information on the history of the beginning of the 4-cam outside. It's amazing to me when people think 4-cams that they think there's only one type of engine, right? That whether it's a 59 Speedster, a 550, a 904, Formula One car, right?
Right.
They all think, it's just a 4-cam engine.
Right.
Can you delve into a little bit more of the intricacies of that evolution and the different types?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, essentially they are all the same principle, but there was an evolution. And I always thought, not being really into Porsche as much as some other people, I got into this part a little bit later in life. I always assumed once I first started delving into 4-cams that the evolution was that they started with the low number and then developed it into the next number, and then it became the final version, the final iteration. And so when they developed the 547 engine, it was to replace the pushrod engine, which they'd been running very successfully as a stopgap measure. The reason the pushrod engine wasn't going to make it for Porsche was in terms of making horsepower, you have to get more revs, and the pushrod engine was limited. So Ernst Fuhrmann, using the research, the knowledge, the passion that he had for mechanics, and he was a multifaceted man. He knew a lot of things about a lot of different things, everything from engines and mechanical stuff. He was a great leader. He was a great manager. He was very personable, but he had high expectations both of himself and his people. But he managed to take all of that information in very short order and create this idea of the 4-cam engine, which is bevel-driven gears. That principle stays the same, of course, through all of them. That's what makes them the 4-cam. The first iterations, in order to make more horsepower, they wanted to reduce friction and make the engine go faster. So the 547, of which this is a slightly later version, has a roller bearing crankshaft. So all of the 547 engines were roller bearing cranks.
That's a question I get all the time. Tim, what's the difference between a roller bearing and the plain bearing?
Right. So and it was very suitable for the time and the horsepower that they were making. The problem turned out to be that the roller bearing crankshaft was expensive to make. It had a finite life. And so it had to be, it was used for motorsports and it was intended for that purpose. So they had to service and repair the crankshafts on a regular basis. The disadvantage came when they started talking about putting the engines in 356s for road use. Now 356s for racing, that's one thing, but when they started selling the cars to the public, they realized that the roller crankshaft engine was going to be too expensive to do. It wasn't going to be reliable for the general public. So they developed a plain bearing crankshaft version, the 692. And that's what they started putting eventually into all of the 356s, so the later Carreras. They did use the roller bearings in some of the early cars until they did that development work.
Yeah, can you shed some light also? You shared with me an interesting point, which I didn't know, and you taught me something earlier today, actually, that there's a misnomer that once the 547 and then the 587, right, then the 547 was no longer being thought, it was forgotten, right?
Yeah.
But can you shed a little light on kind of through the years from 53 really till 64?
Yeah, and I mean the era of the 4-cam was, you know, ultimately roughly 10 years. And I, like everybody, a lot of people, I kind of assumed that it progressed numerically and you had one engine, then it developed. But in fact, all three engines were in production on parallel timelines all the way through. So the most astounding thing for me was the fact that the 547 engine was there all the way through, from the very beginning, of course, because it was the genesis, all the way through to the end. They still made them up until they stopped production of the 4-cam, which was, you know, used in the 904, the 587 engine. That was only in production for a couple of years,
right.
But there was overlap all the way through.
Right.
The 692s were in there, but they were all developed for different purposes, and you run parallel.
Right. That's very fascinating because that's something that I don't think a lot of people know, and that's good insight. So a nice evolution kind of talk and insight into the years of the 4-cam engine and Ernst Fuhrmann. Mm-hmm. What are we doing here, right, in a place where normally we don't allow cameras, in your secret laboratory?
Secret lab.
Right? What are you doing? What are we doing here at Road Scholars that, you know, kind of preserves these engines, you know, for the current caretakers and for the future?
Right. And the thing about my job, and it's the same for other members of the Road Scholars team, is that no restoration is ever the same. We don't always do cookie cutter restorations, you know, that not everything is stripped down to the metal and painted fresh and made gleaming and new. A lot of the cars that we handle, we deal with, are cars that have very specific historical events attached to them, and preserving the patina, the history, all of those pieces, rather than complete restoration, means that we have to kind of adjust and deal with every restoration differently, which is one of the most fascinating parts of my job, is because, you know, this engine was a complete restoration for its reasons. These two, whilst I'll go through them mechanically, they'll be made as perfect as I possibly can. Cosmetically, they're going to go back into a car that isn't being restored. So sometimes we have to deal with that.
Because of their originality.
Because
right?
of their originality.
So to match that hated word patina.
And you don't want to put a polished jewel inside an old case. Right. It wants to match. You don't want it to stand out. So in terms of the restoration work we do, I've been using whatever facilities, resources I have available. There are people who are knowledgeable. Some of those resources are inconsistent because we can't always get them to do work when we need on our timeline. So I'm starting to draw more resources inwards so that we can tackle as much of the more difficult, more time-sensitive work, and have better control over timeline, because it does take a long time to restore one of these cars. Sometimes you can't get the parts. There's lots of stuff that is available, but sometimes stuff isn't always available when you want it, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking. Obviously, your hours, a lot of people understand that these are very complex things, right? But more importantly, you need the parts,
yep.
Right? And sometimes they're unobtainium, right?
Yep.
You certainly can't buy them anymore.
Sometimes, yes. Sometimes, I mean, like I said, sometimes it's hit and miss. You can order for one engine, and then because they only make a certain supply, the next time you order it, it's not there. And dealing with the roller crankshafts, there's no supplier for those parts. The internal pieces of the crankshaft were made specifically for that engine. And so everything has to be, actually I've been in the process of measuring, drawing up in CAD and dealing with a local machine shop who does CNC machining, who have taken on the mantle of manufacturing for us brand new bespoke parts for crankshafts.
Wow, that's fascinating. Sitting here, we have an early 547, right? And just to point out some differences, I'm looking, and even a novice like myself, I see distributors. On the 2-liter, I see distributors in a different location. Where are the distributors going here? What's going on with the distributors?
Well, as we know, the design process was pushed. So they made mistakes. Things didn't work out quite as planned, right. Which happens.
Imagine that, yeah.
So the original iteration of the engine, the 547, as used in the Spider, which is this engine here, as you can see, the distributors are mounted on the intake cams, mounted on the back of the intake cams. And it turned out that because the distributors were driven off the same cam drive, they had all kinds of natural harmonic issues that caused the timing to go off and caused misfires and damage to engines. And they figured it out, and they modified. One of the modifications they did was they moved the distributor's position, and they actually came up with a mod to mount them on the front of the engine on the pulley end at a 30-degree angle. So this was available as a modification for people with 550 Spiders, but then it became normal procedure for them.
Okay.
So this is how they did it initially. They went to the 30-degree, and then on the 692 engines and on the later 2 liters, they went to this 90-degree arrangement. So for production and for the later race engines.
Right.
One of the things that are an obvious sign. It's not always hard and fast because, as I said, this was available as a kit. So you can see an early 550 maybe that has had the conversion done, and you think the distributors are in the wrong place and it's the wrong engine, but it was available from the factory, right. As a conversion kit, and is well documented in the manual. Another thing you can see on the later engines, the shape of the cam covers changed because they realized they had to put weights in the valve train to dampen and absorb some of the energy from all of that rotational mass. So there are actually counterweights on the camshafts later on.
Wow, that's all fascinating. I can't help but think, Simon, standing around pretty significant engines in Porsche history. Personally, what are your thoughts? What are your feelings as far as, what you're doing here, right? And rebuilding these engines and how you're a part of its history, kind of, and what is, here under one big umbrella of road scholars, right, into a very niche thing of working on these special things. Well,
after the initial terror of realizing that I was working on engines that were worth $250,000 to $500,000,
right.
Beyond that, I mean, it really was a continuation from what I'd started experiencing when I was working in the service department. I came from an environment where I came from a city in England, Coventry, that was the center of the motor industry for the English. And that industry people turned their back on that industry and that history. So I missed out on being part of that. I knew a lot of people who worked in the car business, and I had an appreciation for the kinds of people who do that kind of work. I think the biggest thing for me is the historical aspect of saving these cars, engines, parts for the future. Very early on I realized with a lot of the clients that I work with in other businesses that we are caretakers. We're transporting these cars forward, and we need to give them the best that we can. So that's what I try and do on a daily basis is try and do the best job I possibly can so that nobody has to go back in after I'm done and these engines are good to go, to the point where the next person who works on them isn't going to be me because I'll be gone.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
No, that's a great point, and I think you hit the nail on the head. Being a caretaker, right, a point in history. you know, is a very fortunate thing that we're blessed with to be a part of, and that, you know, these engines can continue to be enjoyed for many, many years. So,
and there's so much to learn.
yeah, never know everything, right?
Right.
But literally, thank you for taking time out of your day today.
Thank you for asking me.
And hopefully everyone, that gives you a little bit of insight into the 4-cam Ernst Fuhrmann engine.